Harlem, New York. It was Tuesday morning, March 17, 1970, approximately 10:15 a.m., when Frank Lucas walked into the offices of Sterling & Associates Real Estate on 125th Street and Lenox Avenue, carrying a leather briefcase that weighed approximately 40 pounds due to the $250,000 in cash it contained, all of it bundled in neat stacks of $100 bills that had been counted 3 times the previous evening to ensure the amount was exact. Lucas wore a 3-piece suit from his tailor on Madison Avenue, a navy blue wool blend that had cost him $2,000, a silk tie from Italy, and a gold Rolex President on his left wrist that caught the morning sunlight streaming through the real estate office windows. He looked like a successful businessman, which in many ways he was, though his business involved distributing heroin rather than anything the Chamber of Commerce would recognize as legitimate enterprise. The real estate agent who'd been handling Lucas's property search for the past 6 weeks was named Margaret Chen, a Chinese-American woman in her early 40s who'd built a successful career selling high-end properties throughout Manhattan, and who'd learned early in her profession that asking too many questions about where clients got their money was the fastest way to lose lucrative commissions. Chen had shown Lucas approximately 15 properties over the previous month and a half, brownstones and townhouses and mansions throughout Harlem and the Upper West Side, and Lucas had rejected every single one for various reasons until he'd seen the property at 341 West 148th Street 3 days earlier and had decided immediately that this was the house he wanted to own. The mansion at 341 West 148th Street was a 4-story limestone building that had been constructed in 1895 by a railroad executive named Jonathan Whitmore, who'd made his fortune during the Gilded Age and who'd wanted a residence that reflected his wealth and status. The house contained 12 bedrooms, 8 bathrooms, a library with floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookcases, a ballroom with crystal chandeliers imported from Austria, a dining room that could seat 24 people comfortably, and a basement that had been converted into a wine cellar capable of storing 3,000 bottles. The property occupied an entire lot, included a carriage house that had been converted into a garage capable of housing 6 vehicles, and was surrounded by iron fencing that provided both security and a clear demarcation between the mansion and the surrounding neighborhood. The house had fallen into disrepair during the 1950s and 1960s as Harlem's demographics changed and as white wealthy families moved to the suburbs, leaving their grand houses to be subdivided into apartments or abandoned entirely. By 1970, the mansion at 341 West 148th Street was owned by a holding company controlled by Vincent Rao, a capo in the Genovese crime family who'd purchased the property in 1963 for $35,000 and who'd been using it primarily as a location for high-stakes poker games and as occasional temporary housing for mob associates who needed to stay in Manhattan but wanted to avoid hotels where law enforcement might track them. Rao had listed the property for sale in February 1970 for $200,000, assuming it would take months to find a buyer willing to pay that much for a house in Harlem, when most real estate investors were abandoning the neighborhood rather than investing in it. But Frank Lucas had seen the listing, had toured the property with Margaret Chen, and had decided within 15 minutes of walking through the front door that this mansion represented exactly what he wanted, a statement of power and permanence, a physical manifestation of how far he'd risen from his origins as a poor kid from North Carolina, and a message to everyone in Harlem and everyone in New York's criminal underworld that Frank Lucas had arrived at a level of wealth and influence that demanded recognition and respect. Lucas sat down across the desk from Margaret Chen, placed the leather briefcase on the polished wood surface between them, and opened it to reveal the stacks of $100 bills packed tightly inside. Chen's expression remained professional and neutral, though her eyes widened slightly at the sight of that much cash in one place, at the realization that her commission on this sale would be $12,500, more than most Americans earned in an entire year in 1970. "Mr. Lucas," Chen said, her voice carefully controlled, maintaining the professional demeanor that had made her successful in a business where most people would have been rattled by a client showing up with $250,000 in cash. "I've prepared all the necessary paperwork for the purchase of the property at 341 West 148th Street. However, I should inform you that the current owner, Mr. Rao, has indicated he'd like to meet with you personally before finalizing the sale. He said it was a matter of professional courtesy, given his long association with the property." Lucas understood immediately what this meant. Vincent Rao didn't care about professional courtesy or long associations with property. Rao wanted to meet with Lucas face-to-face to understand who was buying this mansion, to assess whether Lucas posed any threat to mob interests, and to make clear that even though Lucas was purchasing the property legitimately, he was still operating in a city where the Italian mob families controlled significant territory and expected deference from criminals outside their organizations, especially black criminals, who the mob traditionally viewed as subordinate operators who should know their place in the criminal hierarchy. "When does Mr. Rao want to meet?" Lucas asked, his voice carrying that characteristic quiet intensity that made people pay attention even when he wasn't speaking loudly. "This afternoon if you're available," Chen replied. He suggested 2 o'clock at the property itself. He said he'd like to walk through the house with you, discuss its history, and ensure the transaction proceeds smoothly. Lucas nodded once, understanding this wasn't really a request but rather an expectation that he'd comply with Rao's wishes or face complications in closing the sale. "Tell Mr. Rao I'll meet him at 2 o'clock. And Miss Chen, I'd appreciate if you could arrange to have the cash counted and verified today, so we can proceed with closing as quickly as possible once Mr. Rao and I have our conversation." At precisely 2 o'clock that afternoon, Frank Lucas pulled up to 341 West 148th Street in his midnight blue Cadillac Eldorado, parking directly in front of the mansion's iron gates. Vincent Rao was already there, standing on the front steps of the mansion, flanked by 2 younger men who were obviously bodyguards based on their size and the way they positioned themselves to watch the street while Rao focused on Lucas. Rao was 56 years old in March 1970, a heavy-set man with silver hair combed straight back, wearing an expensive charcoal suit that strained slightly across his substantial midsection, and smoking a cigar that probably cost more than most people spent on groceries in a week. Lucas approached the steps with his characteristic unhurried pace, his hands visible and empty, making no sudden movements that might alarm Rao's bodyguards, but also showing no deference or nervousness, carrying himself with the confidence of a man who'd built an empire and who wasn't intimidated by mob capos, regardless of their reputation or connections. Rao watched Lucas approach, his expression neutral but his eyes calculating, assessing this black drug dealer who'd somehow accumulated enough money to purchase a mansion for $250,000 in cash. "Mr. Lucas," Rao said, his voice carrying the distinctive accent of someone who'd grown up in Little Italy. "Thank you for agreeing to meet. I thought it would be appropriate for us to have a conversation before you take ownership of this property. Shall we go inside?" Lucas nodded and followed Rao through the mansion's front entrance, the bodyguards remaining outside but positioned where they could respond quickly if their boss needed assistance. The interior of the mansion was impressive despite years of neglect, with marble floors in the foyer, a grand staircase with an ornate banister, and high ceilings decorated with plaster molding that reflected the craftsmanship of an earlier era when buildings were constructed to demonstrate wealth rather than merely to provide functional space. Rao led Lucas through several rooms on the first floor, pointing out architectural details and sharing stories about the mansion's history, playing the role of a knowledgeable seller showing off a prized property. But Lucas understood this wasn't really about real estate appreciation or historical preservation. This was Rao establishing context, reminding Lucas that this mansion had been owned by powerful people, that it represented a level of status that not everyone had the right to claim, and that purchasing it came with certain expectations and responsibilities. After approximately 15 minutes of walking through the mansion, Rao led Lucas into the library, closed the heavy wooden door behind them, and gestured for Lucas to sit in one of the leather chairs positioned near the fireplace. Rao settled into the opposite chair, relit his cigar that had gone out during the tour, and finally got to the real purpose of this meeting. "Frank, I'm going to be direct with you because I think you're a smart man, and you'll appreciate directness more than games. You're buying this house for $250,000 in cash, which tells me your business is doing very well. My associates and I are aware of your operations, aware that you've been moving substantial quantities of heroin through Harlem and other areas, aware that you've been generating impressive revenues. We've been watching your rise with interest." Lucas remained silent, waiting for Rao to get to whatever point he was building toward, not confirming or denying anything about his business operations, just listening with the patience of a man who knew that people in power liked to hear themselves talk, and that interrupting them usually created problems. Rao continued, "Now, traditionally, drug distribution in New York has been controlled by our families. We have relationships with suppliers, We have distribution networks. We have arrangements with law enforcement that allow us to operate with minimal interference. And traditionally, colored operators have worked within that structure, handling street-level sales and paying appropriate percentages to the families that control territories. But you, Frank, you've been operating outside that traditional structure. You've established your own supply chain. You've built your own distribution network, and you've been keeping all the profits for yourself, rather than paying tribute to the families that have controlled this business for decades. Lucas understood where this was going, had been expecting this conversation ever since his operations had grown large enough to attract attention from the mob families. The Italian organized crime families that controlled New York had always viewed drug distribution as their exclusive domain, had expected Black and Puerto Rican dealers to function as subordinate operators who handled retail sales while paying substantial percentages to mob families for the privilege of operating in territories the mob considered theirs. Lucas had disrupted that arrangement by cutting out the Italian middlemen, by establishing direct connections to heroin suppliers in Southeast Asia, and by building a distribution network that operated independently of mob control. "Mr. Rao," Lucas said, his voice quiet but carrying an edge that suggested he wasn't intimidated by this conversation, "I appreciate you being direct, so I'll be direct in return. I built my business from nothing. I didn't inherit territory or connections from previous generations. I didn't have family organizations supporting me. Everything I achieved through my own intelligence and my own work. And I'm not interested in becoming a subordinate operator paying tribute to organizations I don't belong to, and that didn't help me build what I've built." Rao's expression hardened slightly, the friendly facade dropping away to reveal the calculating mob capo underneath. "Frank, you need to understand the reality of the situation. The families have controlled this city for decades. We have relationships with police, with judges, with politicians, with unions, with businesses throughout New York. If we decide your operations are a problem, we have resources to make your life very difficult. We can pressure your suppliers. We can interfere with your distribution. We can make law enforcement focus on you specifically. We've destroyed bigger operations than yours when operators refuse to work within the established structure." Lucas leaned forward slightly in his chair, his gaze locked on Rao's face, and when he spoke, his voice had dropped even lower, forcing Rao to strain to hear him. "Mr. Rao, with respect, I think you're misjudging the situation. You say the families control this city, and that's true in many areas. But Harlem isn't Little Italy. Harlem isn't the Upper East Side. Harlem is my territory, where I have relationships, where I have support, where your families have limited influence because the people in Harlem don't fear Italian mob families the way people in Italian neighborhoods might. You say you can pressure my suppliers, but my suppliers are in Southeast Asia, completely outside your reach. You say you can make law enforcement focus on me, but law enforcement is already focused on me, and I've managed that problem through my own methods. And you say you can destroy my operations, but Mr. Rao, if you try to destroy my operations, you'll discover that I have resources and methods you haven't accounted for." The room was silent for approximately 10 seconds, tension building as Rao processed what Lucas was saying, calculated whether this was bluster or genuine threat, considered whether pushing this confrontation further would benefit mob interests or would create problems that outweighed any potential advantages. Lucas held Rao's gaze steadily, not challenging but not backing down, communicating through body language and tone that he wasn't someone who could be intimidated into subordination through implicit threats. Finally, Rao leaned back in his chair, took a long draw on his cigar, and when he spoke again, his tone had shifted from threatening to pragmatic. "Frank, I'm not trying to start a war. Wars are expensive and unpredictable, and they attract attention from law enforcement that none of us want. But you need to understand that the families have concerns about independent operators who don't respect traditional arrangements. If you're going to operate at this level, buying mansions in Manhattan, moving the kind of product you're moving, you need to at least demonstrate that you're not a threat to our interests." Lucas understood this was Rao offering a compromise, a way for both of them to walk away from this conversation without either side losing face or committing to future conflict. "Mr. Rao, I have no interest in threatening your interests. I operate in areas that your families have traditionally neglected, serving markets that your organizations haven't focused on. I'm not trying to take over Italian neighborhoods or interfere with your operations. I'm simply running my business in my territory. As long as your families don't interfere with my operations, I see no reason why we can't coexist peacefully. Rao nodded slowly, seeming to accept this formulation. Coexistence works for me, Frank. You stay in your lane, we stay in ours, and we don't create problems for each other. But I want to be clear about something. This house you're buying, this mansion that's going to have your name on the deed, this represents a statement. You're claiming a level of status that traditionally has been reserved for made men and their families. Some of my associates are going to see this purchase as presumptuous, as a colored operator trying to reach above his station. I'm telling you this, not as a threat, but as information you should have. There will be people in our organizations who view your success as an insult, who believe you should be paying tribute rather than buying mansions, and those people may create problems despite any understanding you and I reached today. Lucas stood up from the leather chair, buttoning his suit jacket, preparing to leave but wanting to make one final point clear before this conversation ended. Mr. Rao, I understand that some people in your organizations may be offended by my success, but those people need to understand something fundamental. I'm not asking permission to be successful. I'm not seeking approval from organizations I don't belong to. I'm buying this mansion because I earned the money to buy it, because I want to own it, and because I have every right to purchase property in America, regardless of what anyone thinks about my race or my background or my business. If people in your organizations have problems with that, those are their problems, not mine. And if they decide to act on those problems, they'll discover that I respond decisively to threats. The two men looked at each other for a long moment, each understanding what the other was communicating, each recognizing that this conversation had established boundaries and expectations even if nothing had been agreed to formally or explicitly. Then Rao extended his hand, and Lucas shook it, the gesture sealing an informal understanding that both sides would avoid open conflict as long as neither side provoked the other. "Enjoy your new home, Frank," Rao said as Lucas walked toward the library door. "It's a beautiful property. Take care of it." Lucas nodded once and left the mansion, walked to his Cadillac and drove back to Margaret Chen's office to complete the purchase paperwork. By 5 o'clock that afternoon, the transaction was finalized. The cash had been counted and verified, and Frank Lucas officially owned the mansion at 3041 West 148th Street, the deed registered in his name, the property legally his. The purchase sent shockwaves through both the legitimate real estate community and the criminal underworld. In the real estate community, people marveled that someone had paid $250,000 in cash for a mansion in Harlem, when most investors were divesting from the neighborhood, when property values were declining rather than appreciating, when conventional wisdom said that Harlem was a bad investment. But Lucas understood what conventional real estate investors didn't, that Harlem was his power base, that investing in Harlem demonstrated commitment to the community that generated his wealth, and that owning a magnificent property in the heart of his territory sent a message about permanence and confidence that couldn't be communicated through words alone. In the criminal underworld, Lucas's purchase created anxiety and anger among mob families who viewed his success as a challenge to their traditional dominance. For decades, the Italian organized crime families had maintained control over New York's most lucrative criminal enterprises through a combination of violence, political corruption, and organizational sophistication that independent operators couldn't match. The families had allowed black criminals to operate in subordinate roles, handling street-level drug sales and numbers running and other activities that generated money, but that required dealing with communities the Italian mob preferred to keep at arm's length. But Frank Lucas had disrupted that arrangement by building an operation that competed with mob families, rather than serving them, by generating wealth that rivaled what made men were earning, and now by purchasing a mansion that symbolized a level of status that mob families believed should be reserved for their members. The mansion wasn't just a house. It was a statement that Frank Lucas considered himself equal to mob capos and bosses, that he viewed himself as operating at the same level as the men who controlled New York's organized crime families, and that he had no intention of accepting the subordinate position that black criminals traditionally occupied in the city's criminal hierarchy. Within days of Lucas's purchase becoming known, conversations were occurring in social clubs throughout Little Italy and in mob-controlled businesses across the city. Some mob figures argued for immediate violent response, for making an example of Lucas to demonstrate that black criminals couldn't challenge Italian mob supremacy without facing deadly consequences. Others argued for economic warfare, for using mob influence with law enforcement and with suppliers to destroy Lucas's operations without direct violence that might trigger unpredictable retaliation. But the mob bosses who made final decisions understood something that their more hot-headed subordinates didn't, that Frank Lucas was genuinely dangerous in ways that traditional black criminals hadn't been, that he'd built an operation with independent supply chains and sophisticated distribution networks that couldn't be easily dismantled, and that attacking Lucas would likely trigger a war that would cost more than any potential benefit from destroying him. The mob families had watched Dutch Schultz die after he'd made enemies of people more powerful than himself. They'd watched other mob figures destroyed when they'd started wars they couldn't win, and the smart mobsters understood that Frank Lucas might be one of those operators who was more valuable as an independent competitor, who stayed in his own lane, than as an enemy who would fight back with resources and methods the mob couldn't easily counter. So the mob families made a calculated decision. They would tolerate Frank Lucas's independence, would allow him to operate without interference, would accept his mansion purchase, and his status, and his refusal to pay tribute, as long as he didn't directly challenge mob interests or attempt to expand into territories the families considered exclusively theirs. It was a pragmatic accommodation, a recognition that the world was changing, that black criminals were becoming more sophisticated and more powerful, and that maintaining absolute Italian mob dominance wasn't worth the cost of wars against operators who could fight back effectively. The mob went silent, not because they accepted Frank Lucas as an equal, not because they respected his success, but because they'd calculated that destroying him would cost more than tolerating him. And that silence, that absence of retaliation or interference, represented a form of recognition that Lucas had achieved something unprecedented. He'd forced the Italian organized crime families that controlled New York to acknowledge that a black criminal could operate at the highest levels of the underworld without their permission or approval. Frank Lucas moved into his mansion at 341 West 148th Street in April 1970, threw a party that attracted hundreds of people from throughout Harlem, hired staff to maintain the property and to provide security, and began living openly at a level of luxury that most Americans could only imagine. He drove different luxury cars each day of the week. He wore custom suits and expensive jewelry. He traveled internationally. He invested in legitimate businesses. He donated money to churches and community organizations, and he did all of this visibly, publicly, without attempting to hide his wealth or maintain a low profile, because the whole point of buying the mansion and living lavishly was to demonstrate that he'd achieved success on a scale that demanded recognition and respect. Law enforcement watched Frank Lucas's lifestyle and understood that someone living that visibly, that luxuriously, must be generating enormous illegal revenues. But they struggled to build cases that would result in convictions. Lucas was careful about operational security, used intermediaries for most transactions, maintained layers of separation between himself and street-level distribution, and had enough money to hire excellent lawyers who made prosecutions difficult and expensive. Federal investigators would eventually build a case against Lucas in the mid-1970s, but in 1970, when he purchased his mansion and established himself as one of Harlem's most visible success stories, he seemed untouchable. The mansion at 341 West 148th Street became legendary in Harlem, became a symbol of what was possible for black people who were smart enough and ruthless enough to succeed in America's criminal underworld. Children growing up in Harlem in the early 1970s would walk past Lucas's mansion and dream about achieving similar success, would see the luxury cars parked in the circular driveway and the well-dressed people entering for parties and business meetings, and would understand that Frank Lucas represented a version of the American dream that didn't require college degrees or legitimate employment or acceptance by white society, but only required intelligence and courage and willingness to operate outside the law. The mansion also became a symbol of something darker, of how drug money corrupted communities, of how success in the heroin trade came at the cost of addiction and death and destroyed families throughout Harlem. Critics pointed to Lucas's mansion as evidence of how drug dealers profited from their community suffering, how they lived in luxury while their customers died in alleys and abandoned buildings. The mansion represented both achievement and exploitation, both the possibility of success and the cost of that success measured in human suffering. But in March 1970, when Frank Lucas walked into that real estate office carrying $250,000 in cash and walked out owning one of Harlem's grandest properties, None of those future consequences mattered as much as the immediate reality of what he'd accomplished. A poor kid from North Carolina who'd arrived in Harlem with nothing had purchased a mansion that railroad executives and mob bosses had owned, had forced Italian organized crime families to accept his independence, had demonstrated that black criminals could operate at the highest levels of the underworld without permission from the white power structures that traditionally controlled criminal enterprises. Frank Lucas paid $250,000 in cash for a mansion in Harlem, and the mob went silent. Not because they approved, not because they accepted him as an equal, but because they'd calculated that he was more dangerous than they'd initially assumed, that destroying him would cost more than tolerating him, and that sometimes power meant recognizing when other people had enough power to demand respect, even if that respect wasn't freely given. The mansion stood as a monument to that recognition, as physical proof that Frank Lucas had achieved something unprecedented in New York's criminal underworld, and as a warning to anyone who might consider challenging him that he'd built an empire substantial enough to rival what the mob families had spent generations constructing. The mansion at 341 West 148th Street represented Frank Lucas at the peak of his power, before federal investigators closed in, before his organization was dismantled, before he made the decision to cooperate with authorities that would destroy his reputation in the criminal underworld. But in 1970, when he signed the deed and took ownership of that magnificent property, Frank Lucas seemed invincible, seemed to have solved the problems that destroyed most criminals, seemed to have achieved a level of success that would be permanent and unshakable. The mob had gone silent, and that silence spoke louder than any words could have spoken, communicated respect through absence of interference, acknowledged power through calculated non-aggression. Frank Lucas owned a mansion in Harlem, and the men who'd believed they controlled New York's criminal underworld had decided that some battles weren't worth fighting, that some operators had earned the right to exist independently, and that power sometimes meant accepting new realities rather than destroying yourself, trying to maintain arrangements that no longer served anyone's interests. That was the day Frank Lucas proved he'd truly arrived, that he'd achieved a status that transcended race and traditional hierarchies and conventional assumptions about who could succeed in America's criminal underworld. The mansion stood as testament to that achievement, would stand for decades after Lucas's empire collapsed, would remind anyone who passed it that once, a man named Frank Lucas had built something so substantial that even the mob had to acknowledge his power and step aside rather than fight a war they couldn't be certain of winning.